that when I was the International Torah Fund chair 6, and 7 years ago, I used to be in JTS regularly while Rabbi Tuchman was a student, and I would sit next to her in Minyan, in the Women's League Seminary Synagogue. So it's always very special for me when I saw the clergy as students to come back and now be, real rabbis. So I welcome Rabbi Tuchman, and I'm really happy to hear her words of wisdom and to share with you tonight. It's nice to visit. Thank you for allowing me to do that. Julia.
Thanks, Debbie. And now I'd like to introduce Rabbi Tuchman. I sent out her bio, so I hope you all had a chance to read that. And she's going to be teaching us today. And I'm going to put up on the screen our La'asok prayer. And then, hang on a second.
Julia, I just want to say one thing. Could everybody try to put their cameras on so we can see you? A couple of you do not have the cameras on. And also for your names, can you please write your name on the screen there? So some of you have initials and have other things.
Ellen, I know one person has a conflict, so they have two screens going because they're at work and their screen is not up probably, but their name is.
That's fine if you can. And so I have the prayer up, Rabbi, if you want to lead us in that.
Absolutely. So this is the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. And I am so honored to be here.
I took off the share and just you got muted again, Rabbi. Okay, there you go. If you just let me know if you want me to read the comments that were on the Rosh Hashanah highlights. And
that would be lovely if you could read a few of them. Yeah.
Okay. So let me scroll back up here. Birthdays over Rosh Hashanah. Hosting 13 vaccinated people, benching after Rosh Hashanah dinner, outdoor services, being with family, lots of being with family. My husband did the Birkat Kohanim. It was Carol Simon's birthday yesterday, so we can all celebrate a day later. And friends and family. One person said the rabbi asked, "Where are you?" in a sermon, meaning where am I in my life and where do I want to go? And that hit her very hard. Everybody felt safe in their services. And honors opening the Ark for Winatana Tokef.
Oh, nice, wonderful.
And that's it for now.
Thank you so much for reading those aloud. What a beautiful cacophony of Rosh Hashanah experiences. I also was at outdoor services over Rosh Hashanah, and it was just so beautiful to be with other people, with other vaccinated, it was a vaccinated, you had to be vaccinated to be there. And it was just so beautiful to be in person and to hear other people singing and just the incredible blessings of that. So thank you all so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be here tonight. And I want to thank Debbie for your beautiful words. And also I want to acknowledge that really so many of us who go to the seminary, I graduated JTS 3 years ago. We are incredibly grateful to Torah Fund for all of the support. And I am incredibly grateful to have been asked to be here tonight. And it's really an honor to be with all of you. So I want this to be as interactive as possible. I do want to note up front that it is going to be more frontal, but I really would like this to be interactive. So if you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat and then we'll pause. I'll be pausing throughout to hear them. And also at the end, we're going to leave ample time for some conversation. So today's topic is the Shalosh Regalim. So I know that you all received a packet of readings and handouts and information about the Shalosh Regalim. And what I would like to do to begin is to first explain what the Shalosh Regalim are. But then today, because of the time of year that we are in, we're going to be focusing mostly on Sukkot, and I'm going to try to be as practical as possible when talking about Sukkot. There are a lot of ways we understand Sukkot in terms of the symbols and the spiritual meaning of those symbols. Those are all really beautiful things, and we'll talk about that, but I really want to focus a little bit more on the practical side of what is Sukkot, what is special about Sukkot, how do we prepare ourselves for Sukkot. It's a little bit funny to skip over Yom Kippur, but we're going to skip over Yom Kippur and go right to Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. But before we do that, I just want to back up a second and talk about what are the Shalosh Regalim. So the Shalosh Regalim refer to the 3 pilgrimage festivals. So that's kind of funny we call it the Shalosh Regalim because really there are actually 4 of them, but we'll talk about that in a second. The 3 pilgrimage festivals in which back in temple times, Jewish men were required to go to Yerushalayim, go to the temple in Yerushalayim, and were required to present offerings. And those 3 festivals are Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And as I said earlier, there's actually a 4th that we kind of tack on to Sukkot, but technically it's its own holiday, Shmini Atzeret. And Shmini Atzeret doesn't get referred to as one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. It gets referred to as like a separate day. It's our final day with Hashem before the Chagim ends. But in the Musaf prayer, in the additional service that we say on Shmini Atzeret, we say the exact same text that we say on all of the other festivals. And so that's why I kind of think of Shmini Atzeret as like the final pilgrimage festival, even though it is tacked on to Sukkot, but it actually is its own festival. And so these 3 pilgrimage festivals, the Chagim, are very much connected to the land of Israel and to the agricultural cycle in the land of Israel, in addition to being connected to the Exodus from Egypt. Every single Chag we refer to as a Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, as a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And of course, we think about that mostly when we think about Pesach, right? Because Pesach is all about, Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's the entire reason we observe Pesach. And we think about Shavuot, which is the spring holiday, or maybe we can call the early summer actually, the early summer Chag, as having to do with Matan Torah. We have the Agadata that you have about Matan Torah, about the giving of Torah. And that was also an agricultural festival. And today we think about it mostly in terms of Torah, and also for those who eat dairy, in terms of dairy, and flowers get decorated, get put into the shuls, and it's a really beautiful Chag. And then Sukkot, which we will be entering very, very soon, is actually the final holiday in the holiday cycle. So to back up again 1 second, we have on our calendar actually 4 new years. So we just came out of Rosh Hashanah, which we think of as the new year because it is the new calendrical year and it is the new year for human beings. But the first of Nisan is the new year for festivals. It's also the new year for kings, but for our purposes, it's the new year for festivals. That is why when we think about the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage festivals, we think about Sukkot as the final festival because Pesach occurs in the 1st month. We are now in the 7th month in the new year, but our new year starts in the 7th month. And Sukkot is on the 15th, or begins on the 15th of the 7th month. So I'm now going to pivot and talk a little bit more about Sukkot. So we've talked about what are these 3 festivals, and I'm sure that you'll have an opportunity, if you haven't already, to really delve into Pesach and Shavuot. Pesach happens to be my favorite Chag, but it's a beautiful, beautiful holiday and a beautiful time of year. But because of where we are calendarically, I wanted to focus on Sukkot and what kind of lessons we can take today and how we really can observe this beautiful Chag. So Sukkot is a 7-day festival It begins on the 15th of the month of Tishrei. We are entering very momentarily the 4th of Tishrei with sunset, depending on where you are. The Sukkot begins on the 15th, and it goes through the 21st of Tishrei. And then Shmini Atzeret is on the 22nd. And then in some communities outside of Israel, we also observe Simchat Torah on the 23rd of Tishrei. In some communities outside of Israel, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah are observed together. We can talk about that a little bit later on. But in Leviticus chapter 23, which actually is the Torah reading for the first days of Sukkot, we get an entire calendar, a biblical calendar of festivals. And we're told there that we're supposed to dwell in Sukkot for these 7 days of Sukkot. And why do we dwell in these flimsy structures, these huts, as you were? I don't love the word hut to refer to them, but that's kind of what they are, right? Why do we dwell in these very flimsy structures? Well, we dwell in them because we want to remember the Ananei Kavod, the clouds of glory that accompanied our ancestors throughout their wanderings in the desert. And we also do so as a Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, and to think about the fragility of life. And I feel like, especially this year, we don't really need to delve into fragility of life because we've been sitting with that for 18 months, by which I mean to say, in prior years, I often noticed that when Sukkot would come around, we'd think about those who were experiencing houselessness. We would think about folks who were experiencing poverty of any kind. But the idea of being in a Sukkah because as a way of reminding ourselves of the fragility of life felt a little bit out there and not really so relevant to our lives. And of course, the pandemic has changed all of that and really reminded us of the tremendous wisdom that our tradition has and the tremendous wisdom that Sukkot itself has, because Sukkot is a really paradoxical time of year. It is called in the Torah and in our liturgy, Zman Simchatenu, which means the time of our rejoicing. And at the same time, during Sukkot, we actually do something called the Hoshanah every day of Sukkot, where we take our Lula and Etrog, which we'll talk about those a little bit later on, and we actually circumambulate the bima, and we say these liturgical poems, and they have a very memorable refrain, Hoshanah, Hoshanah, Hoshanah. And that's effectively saying, please, please, please. We are in a lot of ways deeply aware that in the land of Israel, the rainy season is going to start. Shmini Atzeret, we say a particular prayer for rain. And that prayer for rain is for the land of Israel because the rainy season happens after Shmini Atzeret. Although my friends in Israel have been telling me recently that they'll get a rain after Shmini Atzeret as a way of Hashem saying, we heard you, but then it's a little dry for a few weeks after. So, but technically we understand, the tradition understands that the rainy season is really supposed to begin right after Shmini Atzeret, and Sukkot is leading us there. And Sukkot is leading us there because we're also really aware as we're bringing in the fall harvest. Sukkot is also called the Harvest Festival, that we are so deeply dependent upon rainfall for the next year's crop. And that just as right now we are praying to be written in the book of life, those prayers for a good year actually really continue through Hoshanah Rabbah. Hoshanah Rabbah is the last day of Sukkot, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is part of a very large cycle. We are still deeply aware traditionally that we're in a fragile period. In the land of Israel, farmers would be praying for a good yield the next year. Living in the Sukkot was a way of remembering our reliance on that which is greater than we are, because Israel didn't have all the water sources that neighboring places did. And so that is a paradox, because Sukkot is also Zman Simchatenu. It is the time of our rejoicing. It is the happiest Chag, perhaps we can say. It is the time of deep abundance. It's the time of, we've just gone through Yom Kippur. God willing, we've all had a Gemar Chatima Tova, a good seal. We finished with a good seal. We are now through the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, and we have entered into this other period that carries with it both the beauty of the rejoicing and the paradox of the fragility. And another way that that gets underscored is that on the Shabbat of Sukkot, we read Kohelet. Kohelet is the book known in English as Ecclesiastes, and our tradition understands that it was written by King Solomon. We don't know I'm not totally clear from a literary historical perspective what academics say, but traditionally it's understood to be written by King Solomon, and it's him in his later years talking about life, and he's kind of crotchety, and anyone who knows that song by the Birds, turn, turn, turn to every season, turn, 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 there is a purpose, that is taken directly from Kohelet. And that reading on Sukkot is yet another reminder of the fragility and the ephemeral nature of human life. So we have this beautiful paradox that Sukkot invites us into, because we're already kind of primed to be thinking about our existence and the year to come through, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. And even as we enter that joyous place of Sukkot, we are still holding that. And we hold that through Hoshanah Rabbah, and even in some ways into Shmini Atzeret. So I've been mentioning a bunch of different things about Sukkot, and I'm going to back up a little bit and kind of try to walk through each of those things. But before I do, are there any questions that anybody has in the chat, or like a quick comment before I go on?
I don't see anything yet.
Great. If anything does come up, please feel free to interrupt me, because I know that there's a lot here and I want this to be as interactive as possible. So I wanted to just take a couple of moments to talk about the elements of Sukkot. And I'm sure that we're all coming from different places. Some of us may have celebrated Sukkot for many years. Some of us may have never celebrated Sukkot before. So for those of you for whom this is review, there's always more to learn. And for those of you for whom this is new, please feel free to ask me any questions that you have. So Sukkot, there are many mitzvot associated with Sukkot. A mitzvah is a commandment, and we have 613 of them in our tradition. And one of the mitzvot of Sukkot is to lashev basukkah, to dwell in the sukkah. And the sukkah is a temporary structure with at least 3 walls, and then it has skach, which often is bamboo, but it's typically a living or organic matter. My sukkah has bamboo mats on top of it. Some people use tree branches, lots of different options for the skach. But what's most important about the skach is that you have to be able, it cannot be like a roof. This is not a house in the conventional sense. You have to be able to have more, I think you have more shade than sunlight, but still be able to see the stars through the skach. And then the 3 walls, I believe you have to have 2 complete ones, and then one can be a little less than complete. If you really love rabbinic math, you can look at the Mishnah, which is Jewish oral law. There's an entire tractate of Mishnah called Sukkah, and there's an entire tractate of Gemara, of Talmud, of the Babylonian Talmud, which is the authoritative Talmud, called Masechet Sukkah, which incidentally enough, the Daf Yomi, or the daily study cycle of Talmud, just completed a few weeks ago, last week, I believe, actually. And in that particular tractate, there's all kinds of conversations about where can you build a sukkah, and can you build a sukkah on an elephant, and what are all the requirements to have a kosher sukkah. So there are a lot of different requirements around that, and I would definitely look at one of our movement has put out a couple of really good resources that have a lot of like laws of Sukkot if you're building your own sukkah. But that is one of the mitzvot, is to dwell in a sukkah. So what does it mean to dwell in the sukkah? Of course, the rabbis are really interested in this question too, because the rabbis are very detail oriented. And they come down to saying that we dwell in a sukkah when we eat a meal in a sukkah. Some people have different standards of what they would consider a meal. There are some people who won't eat anything outside of a sukkah at all. There are some people who eat snack items outside of a sukkah. But people understand, or Jewish law understands, that a meal includes bread. Obviously, not all of us eat bread for any number of reasons. And today we might think about meals differently because we have very substantial meals that don't involve bread at all. But for the rabbis, a meal inherently meant bread. So anytime, if one is of a more traditional perspective, they would say, well, if I'm going to have bread during Sukkot, I have to eat that bread in a sukkah. And traditionally, when we enter a sukkah, we make a blessing, and we say, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu le'shev b'sukkah. So, blessed are you, Hashem, our God, sovereign of the universe, who commands us to do mitzvot and commands us with the mitzvah of dwelling in the sukkah. We typically do that. We stand when we make the blessing, and then we sit down when we complete the blessing. And there is something really beautiful because our entire body is involved in this mitzvah. There are only a few mitzvot in our tradition that involve the full body, and being in a sukkah is one of them. Although the rabbis do talk about what happens if your sukkah is too small and you could only fit a table, is it okay if your head's in and the rest of your body's outside? For those of us who have very little Sukkot, my sukkah is extraordinarily tiny. I can fit 2 people in it comfortably, and during COVID, I can fit 1 person in there comfortably. So that is a kind of a situation in which, you do the best you can, but that is certainly a question that has come up with conversations around Sukkot. And the other mitzvah specific to Sukkot that I really wanted to talk about is the Lula and the etrog. We also call this the arba minim. So arba is 4, minim literally means kinds. It's often translated as the 4 species, which is a little bit of an odd translation to me. I think the 4 kinds makes a little bit more sense, although that doesn't totally jive in English, but it's referring to the 4 things that we take on Sukkot and we shake it. And this is also talked about in Leviticus 23, where we're talking about Sukkot. And it specifically mentions what are these plants and what are these fruits that we're supposed to take on Sukkot. And they are the lulav, which is the palm branch, which is the long, palm branch, if any of you have shaken a lulav. Then we have the hadas, which are the myrtle branches, and they have a beautiful fragrance. And then the arava, which is the willow. And there are all these interesting Hasidic and spiritual interpretations of what does it mean to take these 4 species. And of course, the 4th species, which happens to be my absolute favorite of all of them, is the etrog, or the citron. And I particularly love the aroma of an etrog, though I have been told, and I am passing this on as a piece of practical advice, it is very ill-advised to make anything with an etrog after Sukkot, because apparently it has been sprayed with all kinds of pesticides and it is not thought of as an edible object. So I have had etrog liqueur in the past, but I won't do it again after having been told that. So I'm just passing that on to any of you who have ever thought about it or have done that yourselves. I have learned that one ought not create anything with a leftover etrog that one plans to consume. So the etrog, of course, is the citron, and it has to have a piton, which is a stem, and that's a halachic requirement. And there's a beautiful, beautiful concept called Hidur mitzvah, or the beautification of a mitzvah. And this really comes into play with all of our mitzvot. So if we're thinking about Rosh Hashanah, maybe someone has a beautiful shofar or a beautiful apple and honey dish. Well, Sukkot, it kind of gets to the next level. People will go to great lengths to buy the most beautiful arba minim that they can, if they're able to. Thank God we are right now, in a world in which we are still able to get our Arba Minim, I don't think that that was necessarily always the case for the Jewish people. So there are a lot of laws about what happens if you only have one set in a community, because everyone is required to have their own on the first day. So what do you do to get around that? We won't go so much into the details of the laws around that, but that's simply to say that we are very lucky that many of us are able to, in one way or another, whether it's by buying our own, whether it's by borrowing, whether it's by being gifted a set, able to access this beautiful, beautiful mitzvah of shaking the 4 species on Sukkot. And why do we do this? It's a really interesting ritual. So we shake in 6 directions, in all of them, in front of us, to the right, to the left, behind us, up and down. And it's the way, some people say it's a way of remembering the Shekhinah, that the divine presence is all around us. And others, and I think this is a bit more of a practical reason, because our ancient ancestors believed, if you actually listen to the sound of a lulav shaking, and this hadn't occurred to me until a few years ago, actually, in one of my classes at JTS, we were talking about this. If you listen to the sound of a lulav shaking, it sounds a little bit like rainfall. And some believe, especially in academic circles, that the reason that we shake lulav and etrog is directly related to praying for rain, because we're singing all these Hoshanah that are praying for lots of different things, and shaking of the lulav and the etrog is another way of doing that. And I think also it's important to note and to name that there are those who would hold that the shaking of the lulav and the etrog is also an ancient fertility rite. If we're thinking about the lulav and the etrog and what they can symbolize, it can make sense to think about this as an ancient fertility ritual in one way or another, and that it can come back to our earth-based rituals, which we as Jews have always had, but have lost for many centuries. And so folks who are really interested in earth-based Judaism have been talking a lot more about the way in which Sukkot really embodies that in a deep way. And so now that we talked a little bit more about the mitzvot of Sukkot, I want to talk a little bit more about why this is considered to be the joyous holiday of the year. And there's something called a Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which is a little bit of an interesting phrase, and it has to do with something called the water drawing festival. And this would happen every night of Sukkot in the temple. And according to the rabbis in the Tractate of Sukkot, they say that if you've never really lived, it's kind of funny, I learned this a couple of weeks ago, you never really live, according to the rabbis of the Gemara, until you've been to a Simchat Beit HaShoeva. It was apparently quite a party. And the temple would just be bursting with people. And of course, the temple is no longer standing. There are some communities that try to imagine what a Simchat Beit HaShoeva would be like. I have never really been, I've been to like one kind of a sort of a Simchat Beit HaShoeva type of a celebration, but there are definitely communities that really run with this. One way to think about it is you can have just beautiful music and singing and l'chaims and whatever you want in the Sukkah. And the Sukkah, lots of our communities do different events in the Sukkah anyway, as a way of like remembering the joyous nature of the Chag. And also, of course, Hidur mitzvah can apply to how we decorate the Sukkah. And hold on one second, I'm just gonna take a quick water. And decorations, of course, are a big part of that, a big component of beautifying a Sukkah and really turning it into our home, because that's one of the goals of the Chag, is really to turn the Sukkah into our actual home for the week. Ideally, and many, some people do this and lots of other people don't, one would actually live in the Sukkah, like to the greatest extent that one possibly could. You would actually just move there for the week. Some people fulfill that idea by sleeping in their Sukkah. Mine is entirely too small unless I want to like scrunch into a tiny little ball. But for those who really like camping, and if the weather is temperate enough, which given how early Sukkot is, for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, we might luck out this year. You could conceivably do that, whether the whole time or one night. It's not a practice that I personally have taken on, but I do try to spend as much time in the Sukkah as I can, weather permitting, of course, because that's the other thing that the rabbis are very aware of. If it rains, you're not required to sit in the Sukkah, even on the holiday days of Sukkot. And there's this notion that if you would be feeling unpleasant in any way, then that detracts from the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah. And therefore, it kind of defeats the purpose of being there. And because we're all women, I wanted to take a second to talk about the traditional understanding of women's obligation. We and our movement have a different understanding. We have, I don't know the right word, but we definitely hold, we think that all people can do all mitzvot. That's our conservative movement. That's how we understand Jewish law. And that's how we understand the role of women. And it's interesting to think about the fact that this, to dwell in a sukkah, is considered to be a time-bound commandment, which makes sense because it only happens at a particular time of year. And so traditionally, women were often exempt from that. So that never meant that women could not dwell in the sukkah. It meant that women were not required. Of course, in a lot of communities, exemption becomes exclusion, and I think it's important to just name that up front. But it was never meant to say that women could not dwell in the sukkah. And we, as conservative Jews, particularly, of course, think that people of all, genders and backgrounds can and should be engaging with Jewish life and ritual life in all of the ways that we can. So I think it's just really important to remember that this is something that's open to all of us, and that there's something so beautiful about spending time in the sukkah. And there is just something really nice about these mitzvot that require us to be, we're all now expert at outdoor dining, right? I remember before the pandemic, I was not a big fan of outdoor dining, I have to say. I would, I'd eat in the sukkah and I had fun. And I always kind of thought it was such a schleppy chag, right? Like you're constantly schlepping so much because you're getting food and doing this and doing that and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and constantly schlepping. And now, of course, we've all become schleppers all the time and learning how to manage in very different environments. And it really makes you think about Sukkot in a very different way when the fragility of human life becomes so much more acute for all of us in all of the ways that we've experienced these past 18 months. Just the wisdom that the tradition has, I think, can really hold us, and can really hold us in the brokenness and really hold us in the everything that we are experiencing this time of year. And I want to end this frontal piece before we really open it up for the to talk and have more conversation by talking about Hoshanah Rabbah. So Hoshanah Rabbah is the final day of Sukkot, and it is such a fascinating day on our calendar. So it is a day in which we do 7 Hoshanot. So we do 7 circles, and there are extensive Hoshanot that are said on Hoshanah Rabbah. We carry our Lula and Etra when we do those 7 circles. And at the end, you may have done this, or maybe your kids have, if you have kids in Hebrew school, or maybe you did as a kid, or maybe all of us have that little child in us that could really use a little bit of getting energy out. At the end of those 7 circles, we do something called the whacking of the willows. We literally take our aravot, or we might get a bundle, like shuls will often hand out these bundles of willows, and quite literally, we bend down and we whack the willows against the floor of the shul until we get as many leaves off of them as possible. And I'm laughing thinking about this because it is just such a fun ritual. And whenever I've had the opportunity to do it, I'm always thinking to myself, there's always that thing that we're told as adults to get in touch with our inner child, right? Like here we are, here's a Jewish ritual that allows us to do that in such a deep way. And Hoshanah Rabbah is understood also liturgically to be the last day in which the gates of repentance are open, which might be surprising because we think, oh, Ne'ilah coming up about this time next week. Oh my goodness. That's the pinnacle, Yom Kippur. Here we are. The gates are open and they're closing. And we even talk about that in Ne'ilah. But in fact, the rabbis really believe that they actually stay open. They actually stay open maybe a crack or two until Hoshanah Rabbah. And it's then on Hoshanah Rabbah, that's when we really end this cycle and move into Shmini Atzeret and the interesting perspective and the interesting pieces of Shmini Atzeret, which I'll talk about at the very end, just to kind of bookend us. And Hoshanah Rabbah has interesting components. So often the prayer leader will wear a kittel, just like on the high holidays, even though it is a weekday. And there are parts of the services that we do on Hoshanah Rabbah. Some of them are done like we would do on high holidays with the same melodies. Some of them would be like we do on festivals, and some of them would be like we do on weekdays. So it's this really weird mixture. It's a weekday. So it's the last day of Sukkot. So work is permitted. When we say work is permitted, we're talking about the malachot, the kinds of work that we cannot do, the kinds of creative labor that traditionally one would not do on Shabbat and festivals. There are 39 categories of those things. So Hoshanah Rabbah is a weekday that is part of Sukkot, but it also has its own little element of a holiday aspect to it. And it also has this element of fervor in praying that we have this last minute to get in all of our last prayers and wishes for a good year. And it's that moment of like the crescendo. It's kind of like the second crescendo after Ne'ilah. And it's also deeply connected to water, because again, at this point, we're really thinking about water. We're about to say the prayer for rain the next day on Shmini Atzeret, and we're just praying with every bit of ourselves for water, for there to be enough for the crops for next year. And because our calendar is completely tied to the land of Israel, for some of us in the diaspora who get rained out on Sukkot, it can feel a little non-congruent, but we have to remember that our cycle is tied to the agricultural cycle of the land of Israel. And so that is why we think a lot about water and rain and praying for good for the next year. And this year in particular, we are now in a Shemitah year. And what's interesting about a Shemitah year is that this is the year when we would have what's called the Hakel, which we'll be reading about, I believe, this coming Shabbat, actually. And the Hakel would happen during Sukkot, during a Shemitah year. And this was the time when everybody would come together, men, women, children, everybody, to hear the entire Torah read aloud. It was sort of like a reaffirmation of Torah that would happen once every 7 years. And there was a certain way in which the fact that that would happen during the Shemitah year made sense, because Shemitah is the sabbatical year. This is the year when in the land of Israel, you're not supposed to cultivate the land. And there's a whole conversation, and I am not an expert in this, but I have been curious about what my friends in Israel are doing. There is a whole conversation about what do you do during Shemitah? How can you make Shemitah applicable? Is it even required because we're not in a time of Mashiach yet? There's a whole conversation about that. But part of what Shemitah really asks of us is to let go, right? To let go and to eat what the land naturally produces, but not to cultivate it ourselves. So when we are getting ready for Sukkot, thinking about the fragility of life, thinking about the joy of living in a sukkah, thinking about being part of the world, we're also letting go, releasing, and we're also, in the time of the temple, we would be having a ceremony, this Sukkot specifically, called Hakel, where we would actually have the entire community hear the Torah. And it makes sense to do it this year because since the land is not being cultivated, you don't have to worry necessarily about farmers missing really necessary times of harvest and gathering and ingathering of the harvest. So I want to pause here. And I know I've said a lot, and I greatly appreciate all of your kind attention as we've talked about the Shalosh Regalim and specifically Sukkot. And I really just want to offer us some time now to have questions, conversation, any practical questions that you have, any memories of Sukkot. Is there anything I didn't cover or you didn't understand that you would love me to clarify? Feel free to, I'll turn it back to Julia or Ellen. Feel free to either write it in the chat or we can call on folks, whatever is easier.
So Rabbi, there were a couple of things when you were talking about the etrog.
Yeah.
And it not being food safe. Somebody commented all the people that make jam along with the etrog cello. A lot of people make jam, but again, not certified food safe. So, and that some people dry out the etrog and put cloves in it.
Oh, yes, I meant to say that. Yes. And you can create besamim for Havdalah.
Right. So you can use that, but she says that their family uses it like in the closet, too.
Oh, yeah, I do that too. I do that too. It's beautiful.
And then a couple of questions about how Sukkot has changed with COVID. I guess they hadn't thought about social distancing or the lack of in your Sukkah.
Yeah.
And then my question was, some of us here have been fortunate to be in the JTS Sukkah, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what that experience is like in this huge.
Oh, I'd be happy to. Absolutely. I'll start, actually, I'm going to talk about COVID first, and then I'll talk about the JTS Sukkah. I'll explain why it's I'm trying to imagine what they're doing this year. So, with COVID and Sukkot, I mean, this is a really difficult, I will say honestly, I last year did not go to any public Sukkot at all. So I don't know. I know that different communities are doing different things where they have sign-up sheets. At least last year they did, where you would have like, okay, so let's say the shul has a sukkah, right? And you want to reserve like an hour for dinner. Okay, so you get this hour, and then we wait 15 minutes, and then the next group gets this hour. Now, technically, really the entire point of being in the sukkah is to be there with people, right? And that we're supposed to be there together, and it's this huge celebration. But of course, with COVID and social distancing and potting, we can't do that in the same way. So my best, and anybody who knows more about this and went to public Sukkot last year, excuse me, anyone who went to public Sukkot last year might know better than I do, but I believe that people are basically just requiring signups, unfortunately. And you go in and you have your allotted time, and that's it, which is quite a contrast. So I had the incredible blessing of many Sukkot in the JTS Sukkah. So for those of you who have been in the JTS Sukkah before, I don't know, I lived through the JTS construction. I was a student when there was a lot of that happening. And I don't know where, I know the campus is opening finally this year. I don't know if they're able to put up their Sukkah. I'm a little bit out of the loop. So anybody who does know and knows if JTS is putting up a Sukkah, I'd love to know.
I actually know the answer to that, Rabbi.
Yeah,
They
are
are.
they putting up a Sukkah?
Ooh, I'm echoing. They are putting up one of the two Sukkot,
Okay.
and hopefully, I had just asked Chancellor Schwartz this, if it will be the Adele Ginsburg Women's League Sukkah, and she said she was not sure, but she would get back to me. But there's room for one, whereas before there were two. Now there's just room for one.
Okay, thank you. I hope it's the Adele Ginsburg Women's League Sukkah. That was the one that I much preferred. I hope that is the one that they're able to put up. They used to have two. I think the Adele Ginsburg Sukkah, was that the one with the round tables?
Yes.
Yes, that was.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the other one had like longer, and basically it was an incredible experience. So a lot of us students, we would go to these, and they were open, I think, to everybody. Like lots of different people were at these meals from the greater JTS community. And JTS would have Yom Tov meals. So we'd have dinner out there, or we'd have lunch out there. They were usually catered. There was a whole experience, like a lot of students, a lot of rabbinical students would work as mashgichim, as kosher supervisors during the Sukkot meals. And there would be a lot of singing, and definitely not a COVID activity. People were jammed packed together. I think about that now and I'm like, oh my goodness, we used to do things like this and nobody thought twice about it. We would all just smush into the sukkah. We would hear Divrei Torah at each meal. Usually a bunch of the undergraduates, the list students would start some kind of very loud and very joyful song session. And a lot of us would join in on that. And there was just something amazing that the irony never really escaped me. I'd be sitting in the seminary courtyard in the middle of Manhattan in a beautiful and large sukkah, thinking about, and I never really thought about this, but I've been thinking about this a lot more, in this relatively spacious sukkah when so many people in New York City barely have a balcony, but we had this bounty, this true bounty that I just don't think I fully appreciated until it wasn't there anymore. And then for a couple of years, JTS put up their sukkah at Union Theological Seminary when the courtyard was under construction. I am so glad to hear they're putting up a sukkah again. I'm sad they only have room for the one, but I'm so, so happy that JTS is putting up a sukkah, because there is something really magical. And if any of you ever have the opportunity to go to the seminary for Sukkot, I could not highly recommend it more, especially with their new campus. I'm sure they're going to have all kinds of new facilities. It is just such a magical time to be there.
Sandy comments that how beautiful the sukkah was, and that when she says when she ate lunch there, the pine that they would use on the top would drop all the needles into the food, and how wonderful that was.
It was wonderful. Oh, thank you for reminding me of that. Oh, thank you so much for reminding me of that. That was absolutely my favorite part of the entire experience. There is just, and you walk in there, not only does the pine needles, not only do they fall into the food and they make it so much better, whatever you're eating just gets that much better because of it, but also just the smell of the pine is so beautiful, and just like it fits in, I think, with the entire like theme of fall and Sukkot. And I think also a lot of kids enjoy the decorations too, and putting them up. And anyone who's ever been involved in decorating a sukkah, that's been a lot of fun. I have not myself participated in the decoration of the JTS sukkah, but I hope that Bimhei Rabbi Amenu, may it be soon, that I will be able to sit in that sukkah again, because it is just an incredible experience.
How many do you think they hold? That was the question. How many people do you think they hold in there?
I don't know. At least, let me think about this. I'm bringing myself back to when there were two of them.
And they have
at least 100 plus. What do you think?
Yeah, because if each round table seats 8, basically, and there's probably 10. There were, I don't know, a lot more than that.
Yeah, I would say at least 100 people.
Another question here on the Shemitah year. Is any planting done, or is it only that the perennial crops are harvested?
My understanding of Shemitah is that you are not allowed to do any kind of planting at all, and that the only crops that you can actually eat during the Shemitah year, which the rabbis talked a lot about how impractical this is. So just to name that, like, it's really hard to just let the land lie fallow. But the only crops that we really are able to eat are those which come up naturally. So exactly, things that are perennial, things that do not require cultivation or planting.
I've seen pictures that not related to that, but I've seen pictures of the etrog markets in Israel.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the bins and finding the most beautiful etrog, and then I wonder, like, that etrog market just crashes after Sukkot.
I know.
Like, it's not used for anything else after that. So
What's really funny is that, like, this time of year, if you look at any of our Jewish like newspapers, like, you'll often find an article that's something along the lines of farmer in, I think I read one of these articles, California grows etrogim for the Jewish holiday of Sukkot and is not themselves Jewish. And it's so interesting, like, what kind of a market there is for etrogim in particular, because it is such a fascinating religious object, right? And, I always think about the fact that we are living in, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, because we're living in such a complicated world. Materially speaking, as Jews, I mean, I can't imagine that, like, my great-grandparents, right, had, their own etrog and got their own a new etrog every year, and it was standard, right? Like, even my grandparents, I can't even imagine if they did that, and now we can go online to our shul and say, I like to order a set for Sukkot. Like, what is that? I think about that a lot.
then there's a question, when did the custom of ushpizin begin?
Oh, thank you. I meant to mention ushpizin. So ushpizin is referring to guests. I believe that began as a Kabbalistic custom in the Zohar, but I don't know that for 100%. And what is ushpizin? So I want to just back up and talk about that. There is a custom that every night of Sukkot, we welcome in our biblical ancestors into the Sukkah. And I don't have the order offhand, but I know the first night it's Sarah and Abraham, and the second night it's Rivka and Yitzchak. And especially, and this is a great, and so I'm so glad this was brought up, because this is a fantastic way for those of us who are really interested in ritual and in inclusion of women to think about who are our ushpizot, who are the women that we want included. Traditionally, it's only the men mentioned. I specifically said Sarah and Abraham because in traditional Sidurim, it will just say Abraham Avinu, but of course, we want to welcome in our imahot also. And it's also a really great opportunity to welcome in women and anyone that we want. And it's like this kind of like spiritual ritual. It's saying, like, I want you here with me. So it could be your mom, it could be your grandma, it could be your booby, it could be whomever that you like welcome into the sukkah with you as part of being there. And particularly for dinner. It's usually done in the evening meal as the new day is beginning, but it's just such a beautiful, beautiful practice.
There's a question here. I read that we can't eat an egg that was laid on a festival. Why is that?
Oh, yes. So Daf Yomi, the study cycle of Talmud, has just begun a tractate called Beitzah. And there's this whole conversation in the opening of the tractate of Beitzah on this notion of Beitzah shel nolad Yom Tov. You can't eat an egg that was laid on Yom Tov. So this has to do with particular Jewish law around food preparation. So to put this in as simple terms as possible, because the rabbis spend like 8 pages talking about this in the Talmud, on Shabbat, traditionally speaking, we don't do bishul, we don't cook. That is one of the 39 things we don't do on Shabbat. On a festival, and of course, thinking about the fact that they're living in a world in which, there's no refrigeration in the way that we have it, you can cook for the needs of the day itself. So if it's Sukkot, it's the first day of Sukkot, and I realize, oh no, I don't have my lunch cooked. I need something to eat, obviously. What am I going to do? Well, assuming that I have a flame that I can use, I can cook a meal that I will then eat. There is a whole conversation about an egg that was laid, whether or not you can eat it on the actual festival or not. And the rabbis pretty much say that you can't, because trying to think about the best way to explain the technicalities, it's a really interesting case that like brings up all kinds of other sidebars upon sidebars. And I think it just simply has to do with the reality that like there is a difference between, so like, let's say, I was saying earlier, it's first day of Sukkot, my lunch isn't done. I can't buy food. But if I have food in my home already that I had before the festival that I was going to eat, I can eat it. But I can't say, oh no, I ran out of this ingredient, I have to go to the store, because I can't, because traditionally one cannot use money on the Chag. So I think it's a similar principle. That egg did not exist prior to the Chag, and therefore it is not, we can't consume it on the Chag itself.
We had a class earlier on the calendar, but
Yeah.
you were saying that Hoshanah Rabbah is a weekday.
Correct.
Can you talk about how you know it's a weekday? How do you know that Hoshanah Rabbah will never be on Shabbat?
Hoshanah Rabbah, so the reason that I know that Hoshanah Rabbah can never fall on Shabbat is because there are 4 calendrical possibilities for Tishrei specifically. So this year, the first day of Sukkot falls on a Tuesday, starts Monday night, falls on a Tuesday. Last year, the first day of Sukkot fell on Shabbat itself, and we can also have Sukkot begin on a Monday. We can have Sukkot begin on a Thursday. We cannot have Sukkot begin on a Wednesday or a Friday or a Sunday. And one of the reasons for this is that on Shabbat itself, you cannot use Lulav and etrog. I meant to say this earlier. I apologize that I neglected this piece. We do not shake Lulav on Shabbat. That has to do with, we don't want to carry the Lulav and etrog in the public domain without an eruv. That's the rabbinic reason. What is an eruv? An eruv is a barrier. It's often a wire that gets put up around a particular area, and that then allows that area to be, for the sake of the eruv, to be a private domain, so you can actually carry from your personal home into the Reshut Rabim, into the public domain. But the rabbis, even if you had an eruv, the rabbis still don't want you carrying a lulav on Sukkot. So Hoshanah Rabbah, why do I say it's a weekday? Hoshanah Rabbah cannot fall on Shabbat because of the ways in which the calendar was calculated to make sure of that. And I think a large part of that is because so many of the mitzvot associated with Hoshanah Rabbah, or so many of the traditions like whacking the willows and the 7 Hoshanot and the Lula, can't do any of that if it's on Shabbat. So I think the rabbis really wanted to make sure that Hoshanah Rabbah always fell on a weekday, which actually brings up a really important point that I totally glossed over. So it is a weekday, but Sukkot is not weekday as we think of weekday, right? Like we're in a normal weekday, like we've got, it's the Aser Yemei Teshuvah, but like this Friday is a Friday. It's a Stam Friday. Notwithstanding the fact that we're thinking about Yom Kippur and our minds are there and Shabbat's coming and all of that. But Sukkot has something called Chol HaMoed. And what that literally means, so does Pesach. Chol HaMoed literally means the weekday of the festival. So the first day or the first 2 days, and I can talk about that, are full holiday days, meaning that they're like Shabbat, except for we can cook food that we already have, and we have longer services, and we keep a particular festival vibe. But then the remaining 5 or 6 days, depending on if you keep 1 or 2 days of Sukkot in the beginning, are known as Chol HaMoed. So work is permitted. Some people have different traditions around what kind of work they will and won't do. Some people won't do their laundry, for example. Some people put off a lot of like necessary, work until after the Chag. But for our purposes, work is permitted on Chol Hamoed, but we still have that celebratory vibe. And that celebratory vibe gets to its pinnacle on Hoshanah Rabbah.
One more thing I remembered on the lulav and etrog, when we were in Israel, people were keeping their lulav, the palm, to burn with their chametz.
Yes, a lot of people do that.
Till Pesach. I thought that was such a nice custom. If you could remember where you put it from Sukkot to Pesach.
Yeah, because it's also part of that is that once Sukkot is over, the lulav and the etrog, we should dispose of them in the best possible way, but they're no longer religiously significant. So part of the reason that some people will save their lulav, specifically the palm, is to use one object that was used for a mitzvah in the fulfillment of yet another mitzvah. So I have tried to do that. Truthfully, I did that last year, and I forgot that I had saved my lulav. So didn't end up burning it with the chametz, but I tried.
Any other questions? You could also raise your hand too, and I'll just flip pages.
I can honestly say I started really observing Sukkot myself at JTS. And when I was a graduate student before I went to rabbinical school. So more than a decade ago now, when I started graduate school at the seminary, the first Sukkah that I ever really sat in, I mean, when I was in college, I went to grad school right out of college. And when I was in college, I think we might have had a Sukkah one year, but our Hillel, we called it a small and mighty Hillel. And I was very connected to it, but we didn't really do Sukkot. And I think about that now and I feel really sad. I'm like, that could have been so much fun. But the way that I learned how to do Sukkot was at JTS for sure. And it was just such a memorable and beautiful experience. I feel so grateful to have had. And I just don't even think I really realized how special it was until after the fact. And I'm just extraordinarily grateful.
Alyssa.
Hi, first of all, tonight has been so informative, and it's really, really wonderful hearing about all of this from you and your stories from JTS. The question I have is, what are some of the really cool, either religious or just fun, awesome things that you do in the Sukkot, in the Sukkah at the JTS? I know all of our synagogues do lots of different activities, and in our own home, we like to have friends over for meals. But what were some of the really significant things that they did?
So I'll give you a really goofy one. One year, and I don't even know what precipitated this. And I love this question because I haven't thought about these things in so long, and these are such beautiful memories. A friend of, I don't even understand. So disclaimer, I don't know what this person wanted to do this for. I don't know why, but I had a friend in rabbinical school who really loved doing dramatic readings of children's books. So one Sukkot, I think it was the second afternoon, we were all pretty tired. We're all ready to, get a little bit more of a nap in. And then, I guess we were all thinking about all the work we had to do after the Chag. They decided to do a dramatic children's book reading in the Sukkah. So they brought all of these, I don't know if any of you have kids or grandkids, but Elephant and Piggy, if anyone knows that series, which I certainly did not before this particular Sukkot. And they just read in dramatic voices, Elephant and Piggy books. It was hilarious. I didn't know what to make of it, but I thought it was quite funny. So that is a completely irreverent thing. And that was not JTS sponsored. That was a bunch of friends just doing that who were using the Sukkah. So I want to be totally clear on that. That was just a fun thing. But on a more serious note, certainly studying Torah in the Sukkah. Sometimes we would have classes, not often, because often the Sukkah was too filled, and often at JTS, I don't even know what the students are doing this year because of the way the Chagim fall. But when I was a student at JTS, we always really struggled every year because school would start right at Tishrei, as it probably did this year. If anyone knows when JTS started, I'd be really curious if they even bothered to start this week or not, if they're just waiting till next week. But we'd often have like a day of school, and then, you know, the Chag, and then like 2 days, and then the next Chag. And especially for rabbinical students who often had jobs, we just lost a month of school. So when we could, we would sometimes have gatherings in the Sukkah, like if we had a couple of days, like if it happened to be a year where Chacham Moed was during the week. So like last year, for example, if COVID had not been COVID, they might have actually been able to have a full week of school during Sukkot. There could have been a way in which people actually would learn with professors in the Sukkah. Also, people will just schmooze and have dinner in the Sukkah. And I know that JTS has a huge schedule of events in the Sukkah every year, and that some of them are open to the public, some of them are not. But my remembrance is that the Sukkot are pretty much always booked. And I would say the coolest thing that I ever did at JTS in the Sukkot, I always loved the impromptu singing that we did, and just the joy. And, you know, it would get colder and colder and colder, and we'd be out there later and later and later, just singing, and just the togetherness, for sure.
I think your point about being comfortable, you know, being joyous in there, the years, like you said, you know, it's not early this year and still warm, but the years where you're sitting out there in your parka, yes, freezing because it's getting toward the end of October, it's hard to think about, you know, being joyous. And also just that commandment, to be commanded to be joyous is a very strange concept, you know.
Yeah.
If you're not, if you're just
right. You know, it's really interesting because our calendar is very emotionally grounded, right? We've come from Tisha B'Av a couple of months ago, where we are deeply commanded to not be joyous, quite the opposite, right? Then we move into these 7 weeks of comforting Haftarot. We've just gotten through that. We have Rosh Hashanah, this Yom Adin. Now we're in the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, and then we're going to move out of that into the most solemn day of the year, which is also actually one of the happiest days of the year, Yom Kippur, which we don't often think about it that way, but actually Yom Kippur is one of the happiest days of the year. The rabbis often call it Yom Kippurim, the day like Purim. And then what happens when we get to Sukkot and being commanded to be joyous? And I struggle with this, right? It feels really hard. It's like, well, how do you command an emotion? And I think that actually what the rabbis are really interested in is not even necessarily our feeling, but our action. So how do we get into the joy of this time of year if we're just not feeling it? Something that I can really relate to. And one of the ways that I work with that myself is, what is the one thing? What is the thing about Sukkot that I love the most? Okay, the etrog. Love the smell of the etrog. That brings me a lot of joy. I love singing Hallel. That brings me a lot of joy. So if I can use those things to kind of anchor myself, that helps me enter that space of feeling commanded to be joyful.
Lots of nodding going on.
Yeah. What I don't love is sitting in a sukkah, in a parka, which I have done. And you're thinking, I'm freezing. I just want to go inside. This year, I know we're all in different locations. I hope that none of us will find ourselves needing to wear multiple layers.
A few years ago, I spent Sukkot in Copenhagen, or at least part of Sukkot, and we went to Chabad there, And because it was Copenhagen, they had armed guards standing, I mean,
Right.
security protection over the, like on the balcony above the Sukkah. So it's like instead of the Shekhinah, the divine presence on your Sukkah, you had a armed soldier, but such is the times. But the other thing they had in the Sukkah were gas heaters.
Oh,
And
wow.
I thought, that is something that we need to import, those restaurant gas heaters.
Oh, yeah.
Because there was plenty of fresh air for them since it was, open to the top. And then it started to rain.
Oh, no.
And I thought, this was a big Sukkah too. And I thought, we're all going to have to go inside. And no, it was like a baseball game. They had a clear plastic tarp over the top, and they just unrolled it right over. And we continued on with the.
JTS had a tarp also, actually, now that I think about it. If it started to rain, yeah, you would just put the little tarp on.
But the tarp has to be clear, right? It has to be transparent.
That's a really interesting question. I was always under the impression that effectively once it started raining and JTS put its roof on the sukkah, whatever it was, that effectively we weren't really, quote, in a sukkah anymore. I think that was more of a practical thing, but that's a really good question. I can look into that.
Rabbi, coming off of that question, I had asked it before and Julia sort of missed it. Have there been any teshuvot written specifically about Sukkot? The rabbis in discussing pre-COVID. I'm sure there's been stuff that they've been discussing in COVID times about the observance of the holiday.
Yeah.
But have there been any specific teshuvot or discussions about, the observance of the holiday in modern times?
I definitely would imagine that the CJLS, the conservative movement, we have something called the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards,
right,
which sets halachic guidance for conservative Judaism. And that guidance is not binding on us, which means that there are teshuvot that the CJLS will write, but they are not the ultimate authority. The ultimate authority for every individual conservative community is the rabbi of the community. So I would guess that there are and have been guidance offered about Sukkot. Whether that is the form of a tshuva itself, I'm not sure of. In terms of, there are plenty of questions that can get tshuva about Sukkot. I would imagine the CJLS has written a lot of them, and probably other communities have as well. But nothing is coming directly to mind, although, as I said, I'm sure that on the Rabbinical Assembly website, there is probably a lot of information about Sukkot in COVID times.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Julia, on the chat?
I don't think so. Do you want to talk, Rabbi, just a minute about the 2 days, 1 day Chag?
I'd be happy to. Okay, so we're gonna get a little in the weeds for a second. So we mentioned earlier about Beitza, the tractate that actually Daf Yomi very coincidentally happens to be learning right now. And there's a discussion in there about 1 day versus 2 day Yom Tov. And what's really interesting about this is that this tractate, the discussion, of course, is happening with the rabbis in Bavel, which is now Iraq, but was outside of the land of Israel. And outside of the land of Israel for centuries and centuries, people traditionally kept 2 days of the pilgrimage festivals of Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, Pesach, and Shavuot. And one of the main reasons given for that is the calendar. So the witnesses would come to Yerushalayim and they would declare the new month, which we just had with Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Hashanah is Rosh Chodesh. But what happens if they weren't able to get to Yerushalayim in time? How would you know what the correct day is? There then became a takana, a decree that in the diaspora, a second day would be kept in case the first day that you thought was the actual Yom Tov was not the right Yom Tov. So it was an issue of safek, an issue of doubt. There was also, though, a conversation about the Samaritans, who were a offshoot of Judaism, and they were not such big fans of the Jews and would often, one of the ways that the message would get out about the Hag to diaspora communities is that torches would be lit on mountaintops, and you would light a torch and you'd see that and light the next one and the next one and the next one, and people would see that and be like, oh, right, the new month has been declared. It's almost time for Hag. We know how to calculate Hag. And so the Samaritans started to kind of mess with that, and they would send out signals on the wrong days. And the rabbis talk in Beitzah about if that had not happened, there would only be one day of Yom Tov everywhere, except for Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is its own separate case of why we keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Even in Israel, they keep 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. And so with Sukkot, in the land of Israel itself, there was never a takana to keep a second day, but in the diaspora, there has been for centuries and centuries and centuries. However, there are diaspora communities today who do not keep a second day. Reform Judaism, I believe, does not keep a second day of any of the Hagim, including actually Rosh Hashanah. Excuse me, including Rosh Hashanah. And then in our movement, there are differences of opinion, as there often are in conservative Judaism. So some people keep 2 days of Yom Tov because, as the rabbis say in Beitzah, the reason today that we keep 2 days of Yom Tov in the diaspora is actually not because of the calendar at all, but it's because there's an idea that is minchag avotenu vayadenu, meaning that our ancestors' minhagim, our ancestors' customs are in our hands to do. So we have an obligation to keep them because that's what's been done, and it's become customary in the diaspora. So that is largely the reason that people have maintained. And also there are those who are more traditionally minded who would say, well, we don't have a Sanhedrin, and therefore we can't nullify the second day of Yom Tov. And then there are those who make the argument, well, okay, so first of all, I can, as I'm going to next week, have a conversation with somebody in Yerushalayim, and I can ask the person I'm having a conversation with, what day is it? And I've done that as a joke with this particular person. I'm like, what day is it? So the distance between communities is not an issue anymore. And there are some people who say, well, we know the calendar, it's been pre-calculated, so we know exactly when the Chagim are. And so why are we keeping 2 days of Yom Tov when we know exactly when the Chag is? When we don't have the issue of safek, we don't have the issue of doubt. So that's why different communities in our movement hold differently. Some of our communities, some of our synagogues keep 1 day, and I think still the majority of us keep 2. And as is the case in our movement, the rabbi of the synagogue is the ultimate decider on that question for the synagogue.
Any other questions? Okay. And you are right. I don't know why I've got this. We did discuss this in Makom B'Yachad. So this is sounding very familiar to many of you. When you attend Makom B'Yachad in mornings, we are overlapping, and that's what's lovely about, Judaism and the discussions we're having and the continuous learning. So thank you, Rabbi. This clarified even more some of the things that many of us have been learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And anything else? Is there anything that you would like to add? I know we were discussing primarily Sukkot, but it is Shalosh Regalim, and we are going to talk about that later in the year. We'll talk about Pesach and Shavuot. But is there anything that you see as any themes that sort of beside the harvest and so forth that go through the three holidays right there? Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I think that there's something beautiful that all of them involve gathering, which is so hard this time, that, in these last 18 months, right? That one of the reasons we call them the Chagim is because you would actually make that pilgrimage and you would be with others, your family, your friends, in these beautifully spiritually potent ways in the temple when the temple stood. And it was just these touch points. Every year I feel like we've got these touch points. It's like, oh, spring is coming. This year we have a leap year, so we have a little bit more time to prepare for Pesach, but Pesach always is here before you know it, right? Like, spring's coming, it's Pesach. And then cheesecake, Shavuot, Torah. But I just think that there's something really beautiful about coming together. And what I want to leave us with is, we come together, we know now, in so many different ways. Some of it's physical and a lot of it is not. And all of the ways that we are coming together are so meaningful and so valid and so wonderful as a part of how we observe Chag. So if you're not able to gather with friends and family for Sukkot this year, if that was your custom, thank God for technology. There's so many ways to bring each other into our Sukkot this year.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Are we, Julie, you want to, I think we're pretty close here on time.
Yeah, I just want to thank Rabbi Tuchman for coming and teaching us today. Before we conclude with our Debbie Friedman song, just a reminder that our next class is going to be October 14th. And we had a little kind of a taste. We will have been through the high holidays. We talked about Sukkot. And then in that class in October, we're going to talk about all the other kind of minor holidays. So we will cover that. And let me see if I can, get to.
Would it be helpful for me to mute for the sound share?
I don't know. We'll see what happens with it. Let me go ahead and share this. Hold on. Didn't put the sound on. Can you hear this? Okay. All right.
May we all know peace and loving kindness in this coming year. Shana Tova, everyone. Thank you. Rabbi, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much
Wonderful.
for having me.
Thank you,
And
Rabbi.
Shana Tova.
This helped us get our heads in the game and ready for Sukkot. And we will look for things to, to help us latch on to something. And we'll